Olá, bom dia a todos. Uma vez mais, bem-vindos a esta sessão, uma semana depois. Muito obrigada a todos os que voltaram a conseguir encaixar no vosso horário a palestra da Jane. E muito obrigada por estarem cá e aos que se conseguiram juntar nesta nova data. Vou voltar a repetir a introdução que fiz na semana passada. Devo dizer, efetivamente, que é com muita alegria que recebemos a Jane hoje e acredito que realmente poderemos aprender muito com a experiência que a Jane tem ao nível dos polinizadores, em particular, tendo em conta o grande objetivo da Rede Colaborativa Polli.NET e a sua grande missão de realmente trabalhar num plano de ação para os polinizadores em Portugal. Assim como passarei a falar em inglês, não só por respeito para com a palestrante, mas também porque creio que podemos ter alguma audiência internacional e daí conseguirmos chegar a todas as pessoas, creio que todos compreenderão. So, switching to English, I'm very happy to have the speaker today, Jane Stout, who will be presenting the talk From Science to Society, the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. Jane is a professor at the School of Natural Sciences in Trinity College in Dublin. And as much of you already know, she's a renowned researcher on Pollinator and Functional Ecology. And she leads a research team, a large research team in the plant-animal interactions research group. Her research seeks to understand how land management practices, including agriculture and urbanization, affect ecological processes, including plant-pollinator interactions, of course, so focusing mainly on that, as well as the benefits of nature for humans. Jane actually develops transdisciplinary work involving a broad range of stakeholders, and which for me is a very good example of how we should work. And these stakeholders include public and private organizations to improve environmental policy and practice. So besides many other activities, sorry for the noise, background noise, besides many other activities, she's co-founder and deputy chair of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, and that's why she's today with us. We are thankful to Jane for this opportunity to learn with your experience, and we are all eager to hear you. So the stage is yours.
Jane Stout, I'm an ecologist at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland and co-founder of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you here today. Just to introduce myself and my research and where I'm coming from, I'm an ecologist and my research spans a range of areas, some of them indicated here on the word cloud, but I'm very much interested in the interactions between people and nature, particularly between bees and other pollinators. And today I'm going to talk to you about how we went from the science of what's happening to pollinators to creating a pollinator policy and some positive solutions for pollinators across Ireland. So just to introduce you to Ireland's nature, Ireland is in an island on the western seaboard of the European landmass, and our nature is a product of this location, our climate, the fact we were covered in ice until 13,000 years ago. And so what we have now is a result of glacial processes, the plants and animals that got here until the land bridge was cut off, and the long history of human activity on the island. But we do have some stunning habitats and species, from these beautiful coastal grasslands to upland bogs and heaths, and a wonderful range of flora and fauna. And our mild, moist Atlantic climate and the diversity of lakes, rivers and bedrock mean that we get some unusual combinations of species as well. So in total, we have about 31,500 species living within 117 habitats. And Ireland is well known for its lush green rolling hills. And this image of Ireland as being very rich in nature is probably quite well established. But our nature, our biodiversity is under threat, as in the same way that nature across the planet is under threat. So agricultural intensification on the one hand, and abandonment on the other, urbanization, pollution, climate change, invasive species, all of these threaten our natural ecosystems and the plants and animals that comprise them. And actually, of our habitats here in Ireland, 85% of our protected habitats are in unfavourable conditions. So according to our Article 17 reporting to the EU. So we have these conservation policies coming from the EU Habitats Directive. And we have these policies to protect our habitats, but they're not working particularly well. We have a policy problem on our protected land. But most of our land area isn't protected. So 64% of the land area in Ireland is dedicated to agriculture. And this is mostly improved or intensely managed grasslands. And you can see this makes Ireland quite different to the rest of Europe on this map based on land cover data. You can see Ireland there really is covered in grassland, in grasslands that are managed for agriculture, for livestock production. And these range in intensity from very intensive to more extensive management. And only a fraction of the farmed area is semi-natural habitats. So we did some surveys between 6 and 41% of land area on farms in Ireland were these kind of natural habitats. So 6% on the very intensive farms and 41% on the more extensive farms. And things like hedgerows and tree lines are protected under agricultural policy. But several other semi-natural habitats that you find on farms, like heathlands, peatlands, woodlands, are not afforded protection under agricultural policy. And in some of our most extensive farms in the west of Ireland, they make up nearly a third of the habitat area of the farms. So we've not only got a policy problem with regards to protected habitats, but also in terms of on-farm habitats, because these habitat features, these semi-natural features on farmland aren't being valued by agricultural policy, so they're at risk of being removed. So that's at the habitats level. At the species level, well, of those 31,500 species that occur in Ireland, we actually only know the conservation status of about 10% of them. So this means we do have a fundamental knowledge gap in how biodiversity is changing in Ireland. But of course, when we lose a habitat, or when a habitat is degraded, we do then lose the species that live there. And of the species that have been assessed in Ireland for their conservation status, 1 in 5, a fifth of our species are at risk of extinction, which is a huge proportion. So what about our bees and our other pollinators? Well, of our bees, we've 100 species of bee in Ireland, 1 honeybee, 21 bumblebees, 78 species of solitary bee. We know that from a red listing process, 1/3 of these species are at risk of extinction. So 1 in 3 bee species in Ireland are at risk of extinction, which is huge. In terms of policy for protected species, none of these bees are protected by law. There's only 1 insect protected by law in Ireland, and this is the marsh fritillary butterfly. It's an Annex II species, so it's protected by the EU Habitats Directive. So conservation policy isn't helping species either. And in terms of agri-environmental policy, the only agri-environmental schemes for bees are the provision of nesting sites, so in the form of bee hotels, as shown in the picture here, and in sand piles for ground nesting bees. But in fact, these measures won't help the majority of our species. There's only a handful of species that nest in these cavities, in these bee hotels, and very little evidence for colonization of sand piles for ground nesting bees. So we have a problem. We have degradation of habitats with loss of species, and our policy responses through the Habitats Directive, through our agri-environmental schemes, are not particularly effective. So this is the kind of the context for why we need some better pollinator policy, that we need some better measures to implement pollinator conservation. Now, Why does pollinator conservation matter? Why should we care about pollinator decline? Well, we need to make the case, and that's where the science comes in. And we know that it's relatively well known that a high proportion of crop species for human food crops, most common human food crops worldwide, are animal pollinated. And you know, virtually every scientific paper you read that talks about pollinators and why we should conserve pollinators says something about the importance of pollinators for the global food system and in terms of our diets. In Ireland, though, we grow very few animal pollinated crops, so orchard crops like apples and soft fruits like strawberries, blackcurrants, raspberries. And so the value of pollinators in the Irish context is actually pretty small. So in terms of crop pollination. So, for example, we calculated dependency of Irish insect pollinated crops and the market values of those crops to come up with some financial values of pollinators in Ireland. And we come up with this value of up to €59 million per year, which is not insignificant, but in the grand scheme of things isn't that big. And also, these crops can be pollinated quite effectively by managed bees, by honeybees, by managed bumblebees. So the question, you know, the policymakers ask is, well, really, why should we conserve pollinators in Ireland? They don't contribute to the economy. We can replace their services with managed pollinators. Why do we need to conserve the diversity of wild pollinators that we have? And two pieces of evidence really help to support the case for conservation of diversity of pollinators in farmland. So this first study here was a meta-analysis of a large number of studies conducted all over the world, including some of the studies we've done in Ireland. And what they show is that as you increase the diversity, the species richness of pollinators in that left-hand graph there, and actually of natural enemies in the right-hand graph, you get an increase in the provision of pollination services on the left and natural enemy biocontrol services on the right. So when you've got more species, when you've got this diversity in the landscape, then you do get a higher rate of service provision in our crop species. Also, another paper published, again, a meta-analysis involving lots of studies, including some of our work from Ireland, shows that if you've not just got diversity in terms of number of species, but in terms of the types of species, so if you've got this functional diversity, so pollinators with different traits, that different body sizes, different behaviours, different tongue length, different activity windows, then when you've got this functional diversity of traits, this can also increase yield to crops. So we can make this argument that actually you do need diversity of pollinators for crop pollination. We can't just rely on a single or a low number of managed species. We need to maintain this diversity. But beyond crops, pollination isn't just important for crop pollination. Pollination is really important ecologically. So it has this huge ecosystem value. So almost 90% of plant species worldwide are animal pollinated. So a good proportion, a high proportion of the plant species in our landscapes are animal pollinated and benefit from a diversity of pollinators in the landscape. And these plants then in the landscape, the communities that they form, then have this really important role ecologically as they support higher trophic levels and as they contribute to ecological functioning, nutrient cycles, water cycles, etc. So the ecological value of pollination in terrestrial ecosystems is vast. So although pollinators benefit the production of 75% of our human food crop species, as well as medicinal plants, other raw materials, and they have this financial market value. Because such a huge proportion of plant species are animal pollinated, pollinator health and reversing pollinator decline has knock-on implications for wild plant communities. These pollinators play other roles in ecosystems, and there's a whole host of other benefits for ecosystems and for society that come from pollinators. So the potential effects of pollinator decline on society are far-reaching. It's not just about protecting crop pollinators. So what we need is policy and action to reverse the drivers of pollinator decline. And there's been a whole wealth of scientific research over the past couple of decades on what's driving pollinator decline. And things like loss of semi-natural habitat, loss of food plants, increased prevalence of disease. We know from our own current situation that emergent diseases can be disastrous. Exposure to pesticides and other chemicals in the environment, as well as changing environments through anthropogenic climate change, lead to these declines in pollinators and of course other species as well. But it's really thought that a combination of these drivers is making things worse. So maybe bees can cope with being sick as long as there's enough food, or they can cope with a monotonous diet as long as it's not contaminated with pesticides or other chemicals. So this is what we know in general, and what we need is the research to understand the specifics for the Irish context and the interactions of these drivers. So, for example, in terms of wildflowers, we know we're losing wildflowers from the landscape. Do we just need more flowers in the landscape, or do we need more of particular types? What resources do different bee species need? And how do plant species differ in terms of the nutritional value of their nectar and pollen? How much of that nectar and pollen is contaminated with pesticides? How does the provision of these flowers change through the year and across the landscape? So we need to really understand a lot more in a lot more detail in order to effectively conserve pollinators. And these questions are some of the things my research group are addressing at the moment. So we're looking at things like determining pesticide residues in crop flowers and wildflowers and the impacts of pesticide residues on different pollinating insects. We're looking at how flora resources and the use of flora resources change through the seasons on our different types of farmland. We're interested in where solitary bees nest and how we can best protect them, and what the interactions between plants and pollinators are, and how these interactions change across urban and rural landscapes. And without knowing all of this, it's hard to implement effective policy to reverse decline. So we need to do the science to provide the scientific evidence base so that we can inform policy. But despite knowing broadly that these are the drivers of decline, pollinators are still in decline. We haven't reversed these drivers of decline. And so the policy that we have so far implemented hasn't yet been effective. So, for example, at European level, these two documents published by EU Court of Auditors show that the EU Common Agricultural Policy hasn't halted the decline of farmland biodiversity, and that the protection of wild pollinators hasn't been successful at a European scale. And our own work has shown that many on-farm semi-natural habitats that would be beneficial to biodiversity are not protected by policy. So common agricultural policy measures don't do enough at a European scale, and in Ireland, farmers don't receive payments for the many beneficial habitats they have on their farms. And so they're at risk of those habitats being removed from the landscape. And in the US, research has shown that insect pollinator policies, so conservation policies at state level, were really lacking in the components identified by biologists as being necessary to tackle the pollinator decline crisis. So whilst we know that pollinators are in decline, we know that they're important, they're valuable in a whole range of different ways, we have implemented policy. This policy hasn't yet been effective. So if we think about what kinds of initiatives are underway and have been underway for pollinators at a range of scales, and actually if we think about it, a lot of these initiatives have been built on the premise that pollinators are important for human food crop production. So even though I've said that pollination of food crops isn't that important in an Irish context as justification, it's hugely important internationally. And internationally, there's been a lot of interest across policy, across society at a range of scales. So at an international scale, initiatives have tended to encompass kind of broad scale statements of intent and really to facilitate networks for promoting awareness on the importance of pollinators and to share knowledge. So for example, in the late 90s, and then in 2002, the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the International Pollinator Initiative for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Pollinators. And this was facilitated and coordinated by the FAO. And this was to promote coordinated worldwide action to monitor pollinator decline, improve management of pollination for sustainable agriculture. So in 2002, the International Pollinators Initiative was very much again, building on this, this premise that we need to protect pollinators because they're important for food production and sustainable agriculture. I think we've moved on from that since then. More recently, the Coalition of the Willing on Pollinators, Promote Pollinators, was initiated in 2016 during CBD COP13, and it's a growing alliance of currently 30 countries and observers who share knowledge to implement policy measures and action to protect pollinators. And these initiatives now are moving beyond the crop pollination and the fact, you know, that we just need to protect bees into the idea that we need to conserve a diversity of pollinators and that they have these wider values. At continental scales, the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign aims to promote pollinator health across Canada, the US and Mexico. And these guys have been at it for years. So they've had annual conferences since 1997. They create task forces to deliver specific objectives, and they're developing a strategic plan for conservation across North America. In contrast, in the EU Pollinators Initiative has set these long-term objectives to 2030 and actions under 3 priority areas. So improving knowledge of decline and the causes and consequences, tackling the causes of decline, and raising awareness and engaging society at large and promoting collaboration. And pollinators, interestingly, the only taxa called out in the next EU biodiversity strategy to 2030. So these circles in the bottom right hand of the slide here are the objectives of the EU biodiversity strategy. You can see highlighted in yellow there. Reverse the decline of pollinators is specifically called out. Other continental initiatives, so for example, the African and the Oceania pollinator initiatives are specific in their goals, and they appear to be less active at the moment. They specifically highlight pollinator conservation to support pollination services for agriculture. And whilst these overarching strategies and plans can promote and coordinate efforts, it's usually up to individual countries, regions within countries, individual land managers or landowners to implement conservation measures on the ground. And so a lot of the European countries have developed national level strategies. So the first was the English strategy in 2014, the All Ireland strategy in 2015. I'll talk some more about that in a second. The Dutch bed and breakfast for bees strategy, the Portuguese, the Polli.NET network, and the Spanish strategy there I've called out across the bottom. But you can see from the map, there's a range of national pollinator plans in place. There's a lot of interest and there's plans in preparation, and also all those countries that have signed up to promote pollinators have given a commitment to developing national level strategies. Most of the national level strategies focus on education and awareness raising, on habitat creation or land management, on improving the knowledge base and doing research, supporting managed pollinators and beekeepers, and tracking changes over time. Some of the strategies specifically focus on reducing risks from pests and disease. So for example, that's in the English strategy, and looking at invasive species. That's invasive species and pesticides actually are in Spain's national strategy. And these national level ambitions really do range from quite broad high level statements of intent to providing direct support for sectoral specific actions. And some of these strategies are associated with dedicated government funding, but they do vary quite a bit. So in Ireland, what we did after we went through this red listing process in 2006 and found that a third of our bees were at risk of extinction, myself and Una Fitzpatrick sat down. Una Fitzpatrick is the senior ecologist at the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and at the time she was working as a postdoc in Trinity. We sat down and we have to do something that has to be done. It took us a few years, and she moved to the National Biodiversity Data Centre, but by 2014, Una had got together a cross-sectoral group of stakeholders, and we developed the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. It was launched in 2015 as a 5-year roadmap. It contained 81 actions to help bees and other pollinators across farmland, public land and private land across the island of Ireland, which comprises both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. So we were the first cross-jurisdiction pollinator strategy. And what we did was each of these actions, so I said there are 81 actions, each of them were associated with a specific organisation or a group who were signing up to deliver those actions. And at the end of each year, Una does an amazing job of collating updates on every action from every organisation signed up to support the plan, so that we can keep track on progress. And one of the first things that we did after launching the Pollinator plan, after, you know, we wrote our own press release, we put it out there, we had no idea whether it was going to go anywhere or if anything was going to happen. We had no support or funding at that stage. But one of the first things we did was to start developing practical advice and evidence-based actions so that people could figure out what to do. And we got a bit of funding, we got a bit of support to start developing these guidelines. And we developed them over several years. Starting with quite broad sectoral guides and then moving on to more specific sectoral guides and technical how-to guides that are shown on the right-hand side of the slide there. And as I've listed in the text at the top there, it's important that these guides were clearly explained, that there were lots of options, and that the actions that we were suggesting were pragmatic and low cost, and that these guidelines were freely available. And really important, I suppose, for me as a scientist, and Una having come through academia, was that they were science-based, they were evidence-based. So we tried to make sure that the actions we were proposing were based on the scientific evidence. And if we didn't have the evidence from Ireland, then evidence from elsewhere. Along with these guidelines, we produced, I say we, most of this work has been led by the National Biodiversity Data Centre, a range of supporting materials. So planting code, pesticide code, advice for farmers, for gardeners. People can now pledge their gardens for pollinators. There's at the bottom there of the slide, you can see these templates that people can print their own signs, and it's wonderful to see these signs popping up the length and breadth of Ireland as people are taking action for pollinators and shouting about it. You know, you stop mowing your lawn and it looks terribly scruffy and messy and people tut at it, but you know, you print out a sign that says I'm doing this for the bees and stick it in the middle of the lawn, and people are much happier about it. So that's one thing we found, is that, you know, having this branding, this really easily identifiable template, it means that when people take action, those actions are more accepted in the local community. And again, all of this stuff is freely available on our website, pollinators.ie. So this year then, in 2021, we launched our new plan. So the 21 to 25 plan, we decided 81 actions wasn't nearly enough. Actually, in the first phase, we achieved, I think, 96% of those actions. So these are new actions, 186 new actions across 6 objectives. The first 3 were really building on the first phase, so about making farmland, public land and private land more pollinator friendly. But then we also now have an all-Ireland honeybee strategy. We have objectives around conservation of rare pollinators. And then we have this coordination objective, which is really, really important, if not a little bit boring to everyone else. But this is all the awareness raising, the research, the supporting databases, supporting organisations that are signed up, and just this overall coordination. So a really important part of the plan. And really what this plan does, so as I say, 186 brand new actions building on the 2015 strategy, but with more partners, more actions, more support, more international interaction. We've got more people on board, more nuanced guidance regarding actions, more monitoring of what's being done, and of the populations of pollinators themselves. And so excitingly, we're starting a pilot national pollinator monitoring scheme next year in 2022, 50 sites, following the EU pollinator monitoring scheme recommendations and using citizen science, so using local experts to help collect data. So really, really excited, because of course, you know, we can take all this action for pollinators, but until we monitor pollinators over a long time frame, we don't know whether our actions are making any difference or not. So if we go back to this idea that there are initiatives and actions for pollinators at various levels, these national level initiatives like the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, like the other national strategies that have been developed, help to inform to stimulate and to coordinate local initiatives. And let's face it, most of the action happens on the ground with local work. And there are many, many local initiatives, either as part of national plans or independent actions, from managing land in a more pollinator-friendly way to providing bee hotels, to engaging local communities, to parks and schools and businesses taking part, lots and lots of local actions. And it's these local initiatives that hugely contributed to the success of the first phase of the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan. And this slide just really summarises some of these initial successes. So people are taking action for pollinators across the length and breadth of Ireland and across sectors, so we can track that in our Actions for Pollinators mapping system. We can see how many sites are logged as being managed as pollinator friendly and what sectors those sites belong to. We collaborated with a national supermarket chain, SuperValue, and sent out materials to all 3,200 primary schools in the Republic of Ireland. Unfortunately, this kicked off exactly the same time as COVID-19 hit, and so we're going to relaunch that programme with SuperValue in 2022, which is really exciting. We've now nearly all, so 86% of the councils, so that's almost all of the local authorities across Ireland have signed up to the Pollinator Plan and agreed to take actions. We've only 6 of the 42 councils across the island of Ireland who haven't signed up. We have 162 local communities that have become pollinator friendly. We've 327 businesses. We actually, this number was higher a few months ago, but we've actually removed those businesses who weren't doing anything meaningful. So these 327 we know are genuinely doing great work, and there's an annual review of the business supporters coming out soon. Really excited to see that. We established a pollinator research network in 2017. It was pretty humble and small initially, but it's grown. It's wonderful to see increase in research across Ireland. We've increased levels of volunteers in the Bumblebee monitoring scheme, and through all these local actions building up into the All-Ireland Pollinator Plan, we've got political recognition. So the implementation of the Pollinator Plan is in our National Biodiversity Action Plan, and we persuaded the Irish government to join this global coalition of Promote Pollinators. And if you're interested in seeing some of the stories, the range of locally led actions that are going on across Ireland, you can have a look at this book that we published earlier this year called Working Together for Biodiversity. It showcases just a tiny fraction of the thousands of local actions for pollinators that are happening across the length and breadth of Ireland, you know, across farmland, the councils, across different site networks, transport corridors, local communities, faith communities, schools and campuses, hospitals, businesses, gardens and sports clubs, and really just an incredible collection of wonderful stories that was put together by the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So if we think about the conservation actions for pollinators that are taking place across different scales, not just here in Ireland, but across Europe and beyond, the key actions in pollinator initiatives can really be grouped into 5 main areas. First of all, in terms of research, so most of these strategies say something about expanding the knowledge base. A lot of the focus of the research has been on the direct drivers of pollinator loss and the consequences for humans in terms of implications for agriculture. The second key area that are addressed within these national level initiatives and actually in the international ones as well is in terms of regulatory issues. So addressing regulation, there are even actions or ambitions around regulation and trade and management of pollinators and agronomic practices. So this is where kind of pesticide regulations and GMOs and things like that come under these regulatory issues. The third area which these initiatives tend to address is in terms of monitoring. So some initiatives aim to assess the status and trends of pollinators, particularly bees, and to monitor some look at monitoring pollination services as well. Fourthly, there's usually a key part of these strategies is public engagement. So including events, materials, media, education initiatives aimed across all sectors of society. And finally, usually there is some actions around land management. So on the ground, restoration and protection of habitats and providing food and nesting resources for pollinators. across a whole range of different land uses. And the initiatives at different scales drive different amounts of activity across these actions. So the international initiatives drive the national ones and probably have most influence on international research initiatives and probably least impact on the ground land management, whereas national initiatives really stimulate research, address these regulatory issues, and can implement widespread monitoring. And really the local initiatives really do great work in terms of public engagement and, as I said before, the on-the-ground restoration and habitat provision. So there's a lot going on at various scales in different places, but there are still considerable knowledge gaps in the science to effectively support these initiatives at societal level. So I'll just run through some of these knowledge gaps. First, in terms of the status and trends for most taxa, so that matrix there shows kind of intensity of research and knowledge about different groups of insects across different geographic areas. And you know, there's been lots of research on common generalist pollinators, especially bees, especially in Northwest Europe and the USA, but most of the diversity of pollinators and their interactions with plants and their role in pollination are very poorly understood for most pollinating taxa for most of the world. And we also still have significant data gaps, even with respect to bees, so bees that are really well studied insects. In Europe, the conservation status of nearly 57% of Europe's 2,000 bee species couldn't be assessed because of a lack of data. So for over 1,000 bee species in Europe, we just don't know enough. And secondly, whilst we know broadly the drivers of decline, and we know the impacts of some of the drivers of decline on some taxa in some contexts, the full range, the full impact of the range of direct drivers and their interactions across pollinators groups, across all contexts, it's just really not clear. And it's not possible to do field experiments or even semi-field or lab tests for all possible situations or even to model every scenario. So this means that our knowledge of the impacts of direct drivers of pollinator decline is relatively limited. And if you add to this the indirect drivers of decline, they're even more complex and multidisciplinary and not very well understood. And these include sociopolitical and economic drivers, technological, cultural, global trade. You know, the factors that influence the direct drivers of decline, they're very complex, they interact with each other and they're hard to predict. So really we need to, it's a multidisciplinary approach, an interdisciplinary approach to understanding these. Thirdly, the benefits and risks of pollinator conservation actions for ecosystems are not always known, they're not always evaluated. So even the benefits of conservation actions for the pollinators themselves are often just assumed. There's very few established monitoring schemes. The UK pollinator monitoring scheme is an exception. And as I mentioned, we're just about to start one here in Ireland. But you really need years of data collection to see the impacts of conservation actions. And there's even less knowledge on the co-benefits of conservation actions for other species and for ecosystem processes. So, for example, actions that increase plant biomass, so providing floral resources or cutting hedgerows less frequently for pollinators, may contribute to an increased primary production overall, might influence nutrient cycling, so nitrogen fixation or water retention or regulating microclimatic conditions. And we don't know very much about these. And I've just put in this screenshot of this tweet this morning. So grasslands that are managed to increase species richness, so species-rich grasslands, which benefit pollinators because they have more flowers, also benefit other organisms like these wonderful fungi from species-rich grasslands. And this was a tweet that the All Ireland Pollinator Plan put out this morning. I thought it was very apt. And there's not much known on these ecological co-benefits. There's also potential negative effects of conservation efforts for pollinators. So by prioritising certain species, certain locations or certain actions at the expense of others could be risky. Conservation action may target common crop pollinators or provide floral resources at the landscape, but we need a diversity of pollinating animals and they need a diversity of food throughout the season and for different life stages, and they also need non-food resources. So we need to make sure that we understand the benefits and the risks of conservation actions. And as well as the benefits that may come for ecosystems, there may be additional benefits for society. And whilst there's a growing understanding of how to assess the multiple values of nature to encompass a range of worldviews, knowledge and value systems, there is a gap in methods and approaches that directly focus on pollinator impacts on human well-being, particularly from a socio-cultural viewpoint. And as I said before, the value of pollinators is almost always quoted in terms of contribution to human food crop production. The non-market values and the co-benefits of pollinators are not well articulated or quantified. And this includes the fact that pollinator conservation could directly benefit taxa that have other beneficial roles in the ecosystem, so those that provide additional services to people. So for example, in agriculture, certain hoverflies act as pollinators in their adult stage but have predatory larvae that act as natural enemies to crop pests, and so play a role in enhancing biological control in cropping systems. And there's wasps and other insects that pollinate as adults that play a role in other parts of their life cycle. There may be other taxa that benefit from pollinator conservation. So the plants that we encourage to give the food to the pollinators play an important ecological role, but also in terms of provision of ecosystem services. So microclimate regulation, soil erosion prevention, acting as windbreaks, and the wider, potential wider co-benefits of pollinator conservation for ecosystem service delivery and other benefits to people haven't been well researched or quantified or integrated into things like natural capital accounting frameworks at various scales. So finally, in terms of our knowledge gaps, there's a huge abundance of online material that promotes pollinator conservation, but we need a better understanding of what actions are appropriate in different contexts. And although some general actions for insect conservation have been articulated, context-specific, tailored and actionable solutions are relatively rare. So for example, when we think about provision of habitat and provision of resources for pollinators, they do tend to be aimed at a small proportion of generalist bee species and often don't include provision of non-floral resources. As well as that, increased awareness and enthusiasm amongst wide swathes of society can result in well-meaning actions for pollinators that are employed at the local level, so planting flowers, installing bee hotels, taking up beekeeping. But these actions may not be based on a scientific understanding and can be ineffective or even harmful to wild pollinators if they're implemented or located wrongly. So we need to fill these knowledge gaps and really to improve pollinator health, to reverse these patterns of decline. We need to acknowledge and address these knowledge gaps and translate what we do know into policy and action. And then it's pretty straightforward. The drivers of decline need to be removed, habitats need to be restored, and this ecological, economic and societal business case for action needs to be articulated. But it requires effective changes in policy and behaviour across all sectors and at a range of governance levels, from individual land managers, local communities, SMEs, local, national, regional governments and multinational businesses. And although this has begun in some places, there's still a lot of progress to be made. And for informed policy making and behaviour change, the society and economy need to be explicitly linked with the biosphere, allowing consideration of interrelations and interdependencies between conservation actions, drivers and impacts, and their relative importance. And one way to do this is via integrated assessment frameworks. These have been used to inform policy making. And one framework that's been developed to explicitly link people and nature is the At Best conceptual framework. And this figure here is an adaptation of that conceptual framework. What it does is it recognizes several components of natural and social systems operating at various spatiotemporal scales, but it was specifically developed to address the fact that reversing loss of biodiversity requires interdisciplinary collaboration, and the institutions, governance and decision-making play a central role. So we can apply this to pollinator conservation to help address the full implications of pollinator decline and humanity's responses to address it. not just for human well-being, but for natural and managed ecosystems more broadly. And we think this framework can be used to bring together the interlinked issues to develop a better understanding of what we're currently missing, not just in terms of the research gaps, but where the action gaps are as well. And I'm not going to go through the whole framework, but just to call out that the anthropogenic assets and the institutions and governance are right at the center of this conceptual framework. And they're really key to influencing the drivers of decline, to influencing the status of nature, to reversing decline, to understanding the benefits to people and our quality of life. So we think thinking about pollinator conservation in the context of this framework will really help us to move forward in terms of going from the science to a more holistic and meaningful action process across society. So to conclude, to address and reverse wild pollinator decline, effective and integrated changes in policy and behaviour are needed across all sectors, not just within agricultural or nature-oriented spheres. We need to build on the vast body of evidence that already exists, but address the knowledge gaps in terms of understanding of pollinator status, the drivers of decline, the co-benefits of pollinator conservation, and the effect that pollinators and conservation of pollinators can have on our own well-being and quality of life. And really, as I said, we need to deliver these appropriate actions and context-specific solutions. So thank you very much. My contact details are there on the slide if you want to follow up on anything. And I suggest you check out pollinators.ie for all the information and the resources from the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And also just at the end, just a shout out to Jeff Ollerton and his lovely book, Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society, which addresses some of these ideas that I've been talking about today in a lot more detail. And if you're short of something for your Christmas list, then I do recommend that you put Jeff's book on it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Hi. So thank you very much, Jane. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you also for the presentation of this holistic framework, which in my perspective looks very interesting because it highlights one key point that I immediately wrote from your talk, that is actually move from an economic value of pollination to ecological value of pollination, because we usually need to communicate an economic value to raise awareness, but actually the ecological value is actually beyond the economic and will impact so many other components that we don't know yet. Actually, we hypothesize, but we are not able yet to quantify, and most probably not in all the entire sense, which I think is very important. And the other point, which I really think it's very pertinent, is this context-specific, tailored action solutions, because from the contact we have here, we understand what, for example, farmers or other stakeholders say, that some measures might not make sense in our context, for example. So they complain, and we don't know sometimes how to answer them because we don't test it in our context yet. So,
and I think that's a real struggle, you know, finding the right solution in the right place is difficult. And I think that's what makes addressing these challenges and challenges to biodiversity conservation in general so much harder, because there's no one size fits all solution. And so what we need to develop is almost a kind of a flow chart of solutions, so that you can try and find something that works in your particular context. And I think that's what we've tried to start to do with the guidelines, is to produce guidelines for different sectors. So if you're this kind of business, then you can do this, and if you've got this kind of garden, then maybe this is the action to take. But it is very complicated and very challenging.
So maybe we can move on to questions, João.
Yeah, we have a question from Marcin Grabowski. I will show it on the screen, but I will also read it. Do you have in Ireland pollinator monitoring to have data which pollinator species or groups are in decline and most important factors are influencing on that? I think you already talked a little bit about that, but when Marcin asked this question, you didn't reach that point, but if you would like to give us some more details about that.
Yeah, so just very shortly then, we have a bumblebee monitoring scheme and we have a butterfly monitoring scheme, and both of those have shown continued declines. We're just establishing a national pollinator monitoring scheme that will start next year. We are through red listing, we know that some of our bee species are at risk of extinction. So, you know, we've got an idea of some groups and in some places, and the general picture, the general pattern seems to be of decline. The main drivers of decline, we think, are probably the same drivers as elsewhere in terms of habitat loss and conversion and degradation, in terms of the way land's managed, use of pesticides. I mean, a lot of Ireland, as I said, is pasture-based, so there's not a huge amount of insecticide use, but there is, of course, still pesticide use, and we're trying to find out what the impacts of that are. And of course, non-native species and climate change and pollution, and these things that are affecting biodiversity in a more general sense is certainly contributing to pollinator decline in Ireland.
Okay, thank you, Jane. So did you want to ask the other question from Federico? I will show it on the screen. I will hide the one from Marcin.
We also have, from Federico. So do you already have examples of monoculture farming cases in Ireland which had success in yields when reducing the use of pesticides and investing in pollinator-friendly practices?
That's a good question. I mean, I suppose, the monocultures that we tend to have over large areas are monocultures of perennial ryegrass in these more intensive livestock grazing systems. And so as I said, not a huge use of pesticide there anyway. What we have got at the moment is a project called Protecting Farmland Pollinators, which is one of these EIP projects, which involves 40 farmers in County Kildare, which is kind of right in the middle of Ireland, and a range of different farming types. So we've beef, dairy, we've arable farmers, so a whole range of farmers in that project. And what they're doing is to implement more pollinator-friendly practices. They're getting a reward for doing that, so it's a results-based reward scheme. We're also monitoring the pollinators. I think the key question is there, does that have any effect on the yields? And my answer is we don't know yet. So I think we are in the process of trying to find out. So yeah, just watch this space.
Yeah, maybe related with pesticides, we don't have yet much scientific knowledge, but related with the improvement of some semi-natural habitats around farms, there are already some reviews that show a positive effect, although I will say again, it will be context dependent because it will depend on the landscape diversity. So if there is diversity in the landscape, there will be populations that pollinator populations that could be sources of resources to
that's right. Yeah, so it very much depends on the habitat context. And what we're trying to do is, in terms of improve land for pollinators without having a knock-on impact on yield. So it really is about managing those edges, the non-farmed areas, the bits that won't have an adverse effect on yield. But yeah, it's as you say, it depends where you are, and we still need to see what the results of that will be.
Okay, so we have a question from Maria Helena Pacheco. How have these concerns in Ireland been integrated into the measures of the next CAP? What are the main differences from the previous CAP, which had few positive results for pollinators?
Thank you. That's another good question, and I'm going to demonstrate my lack of keeping up with what's going on with CAP here. The main thing that we are trying to advocate for in the next CAP is a results-based system. So in the previous CAP, the agri-environment schemes were, farmers were paid for implementing some kind of measure, but not paid according to how successful that measure was in terms of benefiting pollinators or other aspects of biodiversity. So, for example, we had this agri-environment measure, which was these sand piles, which were instigated in good faith because a lot of solitary bees will nest in compact sandy soil, but unfortunately they don't necessarily nest in sand piles. So even though it's easy to audit and it's easy to reward farmers for putting sand piles out, if they don't actually provide any habitat, if it's not actually improving the situation for the pollinators, then it's a waste of money. Farmers will get disheartened that they're doing something that doesn't necessarily help. And so I think that moving to a sort of a more results-based scheme, it would definitely be an advantage.
Yes, some questions or some discussion has been raised also here related, for example, with simple implementation of flower strips, for example, because we start to question the sources of the seeds, if they are, where are they coming from? Will they be a solution or a problem in the long term? Also because our landscape in particular is quite diverse. So sometimes, our land fragments, well, not in the south part, but the traditional agriculture is quite small farms. And it raises a lot of questions as well. So
it does, and that issue of wildflower seed, so called, has been something that we've been tackling all year. Because absolutely, you don't know where those wildflower seeds are coming from in the first place. You don't know whether the mixture that you're sowing is actually beneficial to that diversity of pollinating insects, or whether it's just really targeting at the ones that are doing okay anyway. Some of the bumblebees and the managed honeybees.
That's a good point.
So there's lots of questions around the use of wildflower seed mixes and nectar and pollen mixes, and the advice that we're giving is if you can just allow natural regeneration and change your cutting regime so that you get a strip of whatever's native and local to your area, or reseed with locally sourced seed. Maybe spreading hay from meadows, and if there has to be some sort of pollen and nectar strip, that it's that's what it is. It's a strip of pollen and nectar producing plants. We're not calling them wildflowers. It's an agricultural mix. It's and just to be really clear about what we're doing. And I think it is something that's very confusing, both for not just the farming community but the general public as well, is that they really want to do something to help, and we're saying, actually, do you know what the best thing to do is? Do nothing. And it's that can be frustrating.
Yeah, that's true. That's something that is very important, is to raise awareness that nature needs time.
Absolutely, yes.
They want results immediately, and so it's sometimes so difficult to tell them, now we need to wait 1 year.
Absolutely. And you sow your wildflower strip, or you put in a wildflower turf, you get immediate results, and you get something that looks nice to people but isn't necessarily all that useful. And there's differences about where you implement it as well. If you do that in an urban setting, then maybe you are actually doing it in order to look nice for people and provide some pollen and nectar for insects. But in the countryside and in an agricultural context, it might be quite different. So I think it's it's really important to think about what your objectives are, where you want to get to, and what you're implementing.
Sylvia, do you want to continue?
Yes, we can go to Ana Picanso. So in Ireland, awareness is seemingly more evident on young or older individuals.
That's interesting, Anna. It's do you know what? It's across the board. It's really
it's nice.
It seems to have become an issue that's really really hit across the spectrum of ages, as well as the range of sectors. So it's good. We seem to be getting everyone. I think there's something for everyone in there.
That's good. That's good to know. Thank you, Anna. Jane. So the next one. Do we have more questions?
I think the next one is just a commentary about the intention to implement some some of these measures at a local scale. Okay, here in nearby Coimbra, like Cristina Ferreira.
So I have one question. How do you work with so many different stakeholders? How do you discuss new ideas? This is from a bigger perspective. Are they involved in all the steps? How does it work?
So we have, so as I mentioned, we have this cross-sectoral steering committee, and the steering committee for the Pollinator Plan meets once every 6 months, and that's where we get lots of ideas come in, and that's where we get lots of discussion. When we developed the second phase of the plan that was launched earlier this year, so last year, obviously we were intending to hold a nice big conference and have everyone together and lots of discussion. COVID scuppered that plan, but we put out an online survey. We had done some work at conferences before things closed down, and we got a lot of input, a lot of feed in from lots of different people, and used that to try and develop some of the actions. But it's this stakeholder steering committee that then pulls the ideas together. So that's sort of from the top down, and then from the kind of the bottom up approach, there's just lots and lots of different organizations that contact us. As I said, Una is an amazing coordinator, and we have several now project officers working with us. So we have a community project officer, we have a business project officer, and we have a farmland project officer, and so they're there to help with those particular sectors, and to try and coordinate things, and because it's not all top down, it's very bottom up. So a lot of what the Pollinator Plan does is to coordinate things that people are doing anyway, or that they that they want to do something and they come to us with ideas, and I was thinking of doing this, what do you think? And we're like, well, okay, yeah, this might work, that might not, maybe it's better to do this, and so that dialogue, I think, then develops the practices that are then implemented on the ground. So it's a real I guess it's a back and forth, and it works in different ways.
Yeah, we understand that, because although we are just giving the first steps, we are actually feeling that. So we feel that the steering committee has to organize bigger things, right?
Yeah.
So organize major topics to develop in the next year or so on. But then we are being contacted by small organizations and small groups or people that want to implement something, and we are still struggling a bit how to deal with that and how to help, because we are yet implementing our own group. So
absolutely,
but it's interesting.
We do, sometimes we say we're victims of our own success. It's become so successful, and so many people want to do something, that we when we actually can't meet all the demand. There's way more demand for us to give talks, to run workshops, to give individual tailored advice. There's way more demand than we can actually implement. So that was one reason for developing a lot of the guidelines and a lot of the materials that are online, is that you can then point people towards, say, I haven't got time to do all of this, but there's the information. And there's a lot of, on the website as well, there are a lot of videos and demonstrations of how to do things as well. So, and that's built up. As I said, we started in when we launched this in 2015. So, it's been 6 years of building these materials and building it up and trying to respond to the demand that's out there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you now have also a team that is able to manage different topics, different.
That's right.
That's very important. Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen overnight, and it's been brilliant to, as I said, to get these different project officers, and that's now I'm just trying to think who they're all funded by, but we have funding, a little bit of funding from the government, a little bit of funding through other organisations. So yeah, there's never enough. Obviously, we could probably have 20 people working on this and
wow.
still be overwhelmed.
Yeah.
If someone would fund 20 people, that'd be great.
Yeah, that would be great if you could have like that for Portugal. It would be wonderful. Okay, we have another question.
Yeah,
please.
We have a question from Jana Jasopnik. Do you regulate the amount of the honeybee hives in some natural habitats in Ireland? And thanks for the great talk. Yeah,
you're very welcome, Anna. That's another good question. One of the things we don't know is where all our honeybee hives are. So that at the moment, we don't know what there is. We don't know what the capacity of different environments is to support honeybees. So some habitat types might be particularly they might provide enough resources that you can have, I don't know, a lot of honeybee, a lot of apiaries, a lot of honeybee hives. Whereas there might be other habitats that are more depauperate, that where the wild bees, need all the resources, and we don't know that yet. So that's something that we'd really like to look at. I think that's one of our research objectives actually in the new plan, is to look at this kind of capacity in the landscape and different habitat types to support honeybees, so that we can then say things like, actually, you shouldn't have such a high density of honeybee hives in this kind of habitat type, but and a maximum number in this, so it's something we don't know yet. So no, we don't regulate them yet. The Irish climate and landscape is fairly hard work for honeybees. So we don't have a huge density. It's not like in some of the more southern European countries. So we don't have a massively high density of honeybees anyway. But yeah, we don't know what the optimal number is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
So, would you have any questions, Ron?
No, I was just trying to look if there is some question also on Twitter, because we are also transmitting on Twitter.
Okay.
Let me see. No, not for the moment. Okay. I'm just for the Portuguese people who are watching us. If you want to just put the question in Portuguese, we can easily translate them.
Definitely.
I will speak shortly in português, para os portugueses que nos estão a ver. Se tiver algumas questões em português, estejam à vontade, que nós depois fazemos a tradução, que não seja um problema de
não
barreira
sintam,
linguística.
exatamente.
Também.
So we are appealing to the Portuguese not to be, just to pose the questions in Portuguese, because we can translate them promptly. It was impressive to see the type of landscape in Ireland, because it's really different. I was really surprised when you showed the first map, because you really have a huge percentage of agricultural landscape. So you really need to profit all the small remnants, right?
Absolutely, and I think that I think Ireland has one of the highest percentages of agricultural land in Europe, and almost all of that is grassland. But we do also have huge networks of hedgerows and patches of semi-natural habitat, and I think as you say, that's really important to try and retain and maintain that habitat in the landscape.
How are these linear features quantified when you are analyzing the landscape there? Are they quantified as areas or just as linear features?
It depends in which context they're being quantified.
Okay.
So I think in some cases, the width and the height of the hedgerow is important, because you may have a hedgerow that's big and broad and tall, and that's much more beneficial than a hedgerow that's been cut, that's very narrow, that's very short and boxy. And that's one of the things we've been trying to promote is that often hedgerows are cut very, very short, in order to maintain them, in order for to be able to see, so that if they're by a roadside or something, then to be able to have proper lines of sight. And what we're trying to encourage is then not cutting all of the hedgerows like that. So, okay, if you do need to cut some short for whatever other reasons, is that then leave some others long, or cut them in rotation, and so that we can get this diversity in the landscape. And I think that's the really key thing is, you know, we don't want all the landscape to look the same. So we don't want to manage all of our features in exactly the same way. It's, you know, the point is diversity, biodiversity. That's what we need, is different patches of habitat, different types of habitat, and different management of those habitat types so that you get this diversity back into the landscape.
Yeah, definitely.
Jane, one thing that impresses me a lot on your plan is the map and the mapping of the initiatives and of the landscape of the areas that people change or for pollinators. Do you have some kind of validation of this information? Because I think that the persons can go there and fill a questionnaire about the actions that they do and then put them on the map. But then there is some kind of validation from your side?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So yes, individuals can map, you know, go into the system, draw a polygon around the area that they're managing, and then, you know, answer the questions as to what they're doing. At the moment, now Una manages that system. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn by saying I don't think it's all verified and validated, because we don't have the manpower. We don't have the capacity to do that. But it's a good point, and it's also, you know, people can fill in their actions on the map and then, you know, 1 year and then not bother updating it from year to year. So that's a risk. But the other thing that we found by doing, we had a master's student last summer did a survey, just put a survey out online, and got 700 respondents, and actually I think it was only a quarter of them, because these respondents were all taking actions for pollinators, and it was only a quarter of them said yes, they were logging their actions on the map. So the mapping system,
so many of them been missing there, yeah.
But yeah, it's really only capturing a fraction. I think it's really just giving us a flavour of what's going on. So, you know, it's not everything, and it's also, as you say, it's self-reported and not necessarily verified, but it does give us some impression. So that gives us an idea of what's going on, and then through the annual reporting to the pollinator plan, that's when we get the detail from the organizations for each of the actions and the targets that are in the plan.
Okay. So it's very impressive when we zoom into some of the urban areas and to see that in some neighborhoods they have, like, perhaps in some, I don't know, in a sense like a competition between neighbors to put them, you know, and we can see that in some regions it's highly mapped. It's very impressive.
Yeah, no, and it is, you know, I had a student actually this summer, she was wanting to survey urban actions in central Dublin, and so she went into the map and zoomed in and you know, and then went and visited all the sites to see what they were doing, and, you know, so that she could choose her sites. And yeah, it's actually incredible the amount that's going on.
That's nice.
And you saw some kind of addition from the beginning, or it was taking some time?
Sorry?
Some kind of people started to go with you with the plan since 2015, or it took some time until people started to do
to engage.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure that it you know, we got people on board straight away. I think there was an appetite for it. We were to some extent lucky that we launched when we did, when there was a growing awareness and appreciation for nature. As I said, you know, we first started talking about doing this back in 2008, 2009, and of course, with the economic crash, there was very little appetite. But by 2014, 15, you know, we understood a lot more about what was happening to wildlife. Bees are becoming a sort of a flagship internationally, and I think, you know, we were lucky with the timing that people were looking for things to do, and so it you know, this filled a gap, I guess, you know, a gap that we didn't necessarily realise that was there, but that people came on board very quickly, and we were surprised, you know, by doing these annual reviews, and every year tracking the progress, we could see what was happening. And actually, I just got an email from Una today to say that for the review for 2021 of our new plan with its 186 actions, I think something like over 80% of those are already in train or completed. And we only launched in March this year, so it's
wonderful.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's
and also
wonderful.
from the political side, you also have political support for everything, or it depended?
So I suppose initially, not necessarily. So when we launched, we were, it was we didn't have any obligation to do this. We weren't asked to do it by any from any political viewpoint, and so we just did it anyway. Since then, it has been recognised politically. It's in our national biodiversity strategy, in our national biodiversity action plan, and it's it's been widely recognised. We've the Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, has endorsed it. Our President has endorsed it. It's been widely recognised as a very successful conservation
initiative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very nice.
Yeah, congratulations. I think it's wonderful the work you have been developing, and we actually here we see it as a model, not to apply it as it is here, because we have to adjust a lot of things to our current knowledge about pollinators in Portugal. But I think it's a very good example of well succeeded, and I think it's very, very good that you are already ahead, so that we can also gain some advices from you. So yeah,
well, I think
thank you.
we've been you're very welcome, and we've sort of we've been making it up as we go along. So it's amazing that it's worked out, and if we can help anyone else, absolutely more than happy to.
Okay, so to finish, perhaps I will, because there are no more questions, but there are a few comments of congratulations that I think it's nice for you to see and to show it on the screen. So this one from João Cardoso, no questions, but congratulations for the excellent presentation work developed. And this one from Elena Saya, thanks, a very interesting talk. I learned a lot from your experience. So I think it's a good way to finish our broadcast from today, and to thank you once again, Jane, for being with us after the first time that didn't went as planned, but I think
I'm glad it worked today.
Okay. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Okay. Obrigado a todos que estiveram connosco nesta tarde, e quem não apanhou desde o início a transmissão pode depois sempre voltar a ver, está bem? Thank you very much. Obrigado a todos e uma boa tarde.